Hi, my name is Mark Zamoyda, and welcome to this module, Objects and the DOM. We've already took a quick look at objects, and we saw how an object can contain multiple properties, or multiple values that are related. And what DOM stands for is Document Object Model. When we want to modify the web page in JavaScript, the key object we work with is called document. And the DOM, or the Document Object Model, refers to that document object along with all of its supporting objects and other features. So in this module, we'll take a closer look at objects and programming web pages through the DOM. We'll start off by taking a closer look at object properties and object methods. Properties are similar to variables attached to the object, and methods are similar to functions attached to an object, and we'll be taking a closer look. Next, we'll take a look at passing objects to functions. This doesn't always behave as expected, so we want to make sure we understand the difference between passing an object and passing something that's a value such as a string. Next, we'll look at some standard built-in objects. We'll go to the Mozilla Developer Network and see how we can find out about these objects and look at their documentation and use them in some code. Next, we'll look at the document object, which is part of the Document Object Model, the DOM. And we'll see how we can use that to modify web pages. We'll see how to style DOM elements. Normally you would use a CSS file, but you could also do this through JavaScript. And we'll take a look at how we can handle button clicks or any other event that occurs on a website. And finally, we'll see how we can show and hide DOM elements. We'll be working with CSS classes for this. So let's get started and take a look at object properties. Objects usually have several properties. If you think of a real-world object, such as a car, some of its properties might be the number of doors, the engine size, what type of fuel it takes, and so on. So you can think of an object as a group of values or properties. Here's how we create an object in JavaScript. We use the curly braces. You need the opening and closing curly braces, and we don't have any properties listed here, but you can see that this empty object is being assigned to a new variable called person. Let's see how we add properties. So between the curly braces, we enter a property name, a colon, and a value. So person has a property name, and we're setting its value to John. And for multiple properties, we need to separate those by commas. We have a property age that we're setting to the number 32. Notice there's no quotes, so we know it's a number. Comma. And a new property part-time, which we're setting to false, a Boolean value. So as you can see, these properties can have any data type. You can even have objects inside other objects if you want. That's very common. But once we have an object, let's see how we access these properties. Here's our object we just created, and we're logging out person dot. This is called a dot syntax. You specify the object and a dot and a property name. So person.name will be John. Person.age will be 32, and person.parttime will be false. Let's go to Visual Studio Code and see this in action. Here's our person object. We're using the same values from the slides, and we'll show message person.name. So the person object dot property name, which should be John. I'll save it, and we get John. Likewise, if we specified age, I'll save it, and we get 32. But you need to be careful that you access actual properties. What if we tried to access a property that doesn't exist, such as country? I'll save it. And we didn't get an error because the debugger didn't kick in, but it looks like we have an undefined value. So when you're working with objects, you need to be very sure that you're working with the exact property names that do exist. Objects can be changed easily. Let's say we wanted to change the age to 33. We're working with our person variable, so we can say person.age, and we can just assign a new value to it. So we'll assign 33. We'll show message person.age just to make sure it works. And we get 33. So here we're using the dot syntax on an object to access a property. But there's another way. We can use square brackets. The property name needs to be a string. So we have our square bracket, and then age as a string, and we end off the square bracket. And I'll just set this to 44 just to make sure it changes. I'll save it. And we can see that that works fine. So we can use the dot notation as we see here. or we can use the square bracket notation as we see here. Earlier in this course, I mentioned a special data type called a symbol, and that's more of an advanced data type. But just to briefly describe it again, let's create a symbol here before our object. I'll call it my symbol. And this is how we create a new symbol with this syntax. And a symbol can be used inside of an object to hide information. So I'll use the square bracket notation here and enter my symbol. I'm not using quotes because it's a variable name. And we can set some kind of custom information that only we can get access to. And this is an advanced scenario. This would be used in cases where, say, you're working with an HR system that wanted to hide salary information, or you're working with some kind of plugin architecture where each plugin had its own secret information specific to that plugin. So I won't go into too much detail on that here. But basically, with this symbol attached, we can pass around person as an object, but the only code that would be able to access this property here would be code which had access to my symbol. So that's the basics on properties. In the next clip, we'll take a look at methods. Methods are simply functions that get attached to objects, and we'll learn about those in the next clip. We've seen how an object can be composed of data. Those are the object's properties. But we can also attach functions directly to objects, and those functions are called methods. Let's see how we do this. Here's our simple person object, and let's add a method to it. We'll add a new property and we'll call it showInfo for show information about this person. But instead of setting it to some value, we'll set it to a function. And we won't take any parameters here, but we can go ahead and make the function body and add whatever source code we'd like. So within here, let's show message, and we can say in showInfo. And of course, we could add as many lines of code as we'd like here. So instead of calling show message, I'll just call person.showInfo. When this executes, it'll call this function and show the message. I'll save it, and we get in showInfo. So this is working great, but one thing that's very common in these methods is accessing the data within the object. So instead of showing this static string here, let's show name. But the problem is that this function is unaware of what name is. Let's save it and see what we get. We get some kind of confusing Bootstrap code because name probably belongs in the Bootstrap namespace. So what we do to access information within an object is we use the this keyword. And this refers to the current object. So we're working with this person object. So this.name refers to John right here. I'll save this. And we get John as we expect. Now it's very easy to forget to put the this keyword on properties. So as soon as you start getting undefined values that are actually defined, or things aren't working the way they should be, just make sure that you put this.property name to work with the current object. And we could say something like this.name plus the string is plus this.age to get the age value. John is 32. And of course, because this is a function, we could have a return value and we could also have parameters. Let's put a parameter real age and we'll pass it 34. And I'll just log out the real age rather than the object's age. I'll save it. And it says John is 34 now. So we would call showInfo a method because it's part of an object, but some developers might still refer to it as a function. And that's fine too, because within JavaScript, it really is a function. One thing we can do here is we can show message, type of person.showInfo. And I'll save it. And you can see that person.showInfo is a function. But because it's attached to an object, it's traditionally called a method. In the next clip, we'll take a look at passing objects to functions. There are a few tricky things about that. There's a very big difference between passing an object to a function and passing a built-in type such as a string, a number, or a Boolean value to a function. This is the source of a lot of problems and a lot of bugs. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about. Let's look at this example code right here. We're setting message, a new variable, equal to hello. We're creating a function called changeMessage, which takes the message and just changes that message to hi. It doesn't return anything, All it does is it changes message to hi. And then we execute change message, and we'll pass it the message hello. And then we'll show message message. So what do you think is going to show? Is it going to be hello, or is it going to be hi? I'll save it and we'll find out. We get hello. So when we call change message passing it message right here, it actually took the value of hello and stored it in the parameter message. And then this line in the function only changed the parameter. It didn't change our original variable message. So by the time we call show message, we're still working with our original message variable. So we're passing this argument message by its value. The new value gets stored in the parameter, and changes to that parameter have no effect on later code. Now I'm showing this here because it's very different than the way objects work. Let me paste an example of code using an object. Let's look at this example here. We have our simple person object with a name, age, and part-time value, and we're creating a function called increment age. We're passing it person. So we want to add 1 to the age. So we call person.age++. That's the increment operator that will increment age by 1. So at this point in the code, age should be 33. And then we leave the function and we'll show message person.age. Do you think we'll get 32 or 33? I'll save it. And we get 33. So this is very different than the string example we just saw. Because we're passing an object to increment age, when we access properties or methods on that object, we are able to change them. We can't change the person object itself as an object, but we can access all of its properties, subproperties, and methods. And this is called passing by reference. When we call increment age here, passing it person, it's as if we're passing a pointer to that person, and we do get access to all of the real properties and methods. Even if we change the name here to something like simply P for person. The fact that the parameter name changed has no difference. I'll save it, and we still get 33. So just be aware that when we pass objects, we are able to modify their properties and methods. But when we pass some data by value, such as a string or a number or a Boolean value, any changes made to those will be lost. So it's really worth making a lot of examples when you're playing around with this. Practice sending values to functions and practice sending objects to functions. And make sure you see how they work, because they're very different. Again, when you pass an object, that function has free access to change all of its properties and methods. In the next clip, we'll take a look at some of the popular built-in objects in JavaScript. Now that we know the basics of objects, it would be a good time to take a look at JavaScript's standard built-in objects. We've already been using these, but let's take a look in more detail. I'm at the Mozilla Developer Network, MDN, and I searched for standard built-in objects. These are great objects that we have access to in JavaScript that really make our lives easier. Let's take a look at some of them. I'll scroll down, and if we look on the left side, you can see this built-in objects section. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just to mention arrays quickly, we're going to be covering arrays in the next course module. But an array is basically a group of objects or a group of values. For example, we saw a person object, but what if you have a whole team of people? You might have 20 people and you would store those in an array. But we'll be looking at that shortly. Looking down this list a bit, we can see the date object. Let's look at that. It's extremely common to be working with dates, and you can read all about them here. If we scroll down, we can see that there are lots of methods attached to dates. You'll notice this prototype property here, and that would be explained in a more advanced course on JavaScript objects. But just know that whenever we have a date object, we can access anything on the prototype. So the important parts are here. These are the methods that we can use on any date. For example, if you wanted to get the number of minutes out of a date, you could use this method. Or to get just the time section of the date variable, you could call this. But looking at this syntax here, this is how we get the current date. And we can store that in a variable and work with these methods. And I'll scroll down a bit more. And we have a method toDateString. That will convert a date into a string. Let's just quickly take a look at how to work with dates. I'll create a new date variable, and I'll just call it now, and we say new date. with the opening and closing parentheses. And to turn that into a string, we can say now.toDateString with the opening and closing parentheses. So I'll save this, and the date comes up, Thursday, December 19th, 2019. But the key thing I wanted to point out is this is how we get the current date and store it in a variable. Going back to the website, we can now use that variable and call all of these methods. There are a lot of them. So to move on to the next built-in object I wanted to show you, I'll scroll down from date, and we see math right here. I'll go there, and I'll scroll down, and we can look at some properties on math. There's a property called pi. If you wanted to get access to the value of pi, you would just specify this exact string, math.pi. But there are many, many methods. The first one is for an absolute value. And you can see that we have access to a whole lot of methods. One useful method is math.random. This would be useful in creating random numbers for games or graphics or something like that. And we have extremely popular formulas such as square root. And to round a number, we could use math.round. And notice that these aren't attached to that prototype property we saw. They're directly on math. So just going to the top of the list, let's just use math.abs for absolute value. I'll remove the date code we were working with. And let's just show message math.abs for absolute value. And we'll put in a negative 42. I'll save it. And we get 42. If you're not familiar with absolute value, it just removes the negative sign. Likewise for math.random, I'll save it, and we get a decimal number. So go ahead and read all of the documentation on whatever method you should be interested in for your formulas and for your code. I'll go back, and if we scroll down a bit more, we can see string. We've already seen a property and a bunch of methods on string, but let's take a look at the documentation now. Here's the property we looked at. We saw that when we had a string variable, we could call the length property to get the number of characters in the string. But then we have all these methods. Just beware that we have some of these thumbs down symbols over here, which means that these methods are deprecated. We shouldn't really be using them because they might disappear in the future. But something like char@, for character at, is extremely useful. This gives us the character at a specific index within the string. Let's take a look at that. So let's create a string hello, and we'll log out s.char@, for character at, and we'll say index 0. You can see that we're getting help from Visual Studio Code here. It's telling us what argument it's expecting. It's a position, a number. So I'll put 0, and I'll save it. And we get the h, which is position 0 in hello. Remember, positioning starts at 0, not 1. So if we wanted to get the e in hello, that would be char@1. I'll save it, and we get the e. And there are dozens of these methods that we can use with strings. So be sure to read through this documentation and mind that we have these deprecated methods that you can ignore. But string methods are something that developers use pretty much every day. So it's good to be aware of all these. And finally, the last object I wanted to show you after string was the number object right here. We've worked with numbers a little bit, and if we look at the properties, we've seen one called not a number, NaN. So we could compare a number variable to NaN by using this property right here, number.nan. Likewise, there are values for positive infinity and negative infinity, and the min value for a number and the max value for a number. Those could come in useful in certain calculations, but the methods are used very commonly. We can test if a number is not a number by using this method right here, and we've already seen how we can call parse float to take a string and parse a float number out of it. Likewise, we saw toFixed, where we have the number rounded to a fixed number of decimal places. But numbers are used very often, and reading through these and understanding these methods and properties is very useful. So that's all I wanted to show you for now. This is an introductory course, but many of the other Pluralsight courses will go through a lot of these built-in objects. Again, you go to the MDN, Mozilla Developer Network, and you can search for standard built-in objects. The most popular use of JavaScript has been as a scripting language behind web pages. But we can also use JavaScript now with technologies such as Node.js to run JavaScript on the server. And with technologies such as Cordova, we can run JavaScript apps on mobile devices and tablets. But this clip and the next few clips are going to focus mainly on browser programming. One of the biggest objects we're going to work with as far as user interface goes is the web page itself. And that web page is built up of objects. This is commonly referred to as the document object model, or the DOM. You would say that you would program the DOM. And that refers to modifying the web page and getting events from a user using the web page. Events such as a user typing in information or clicking a button. But all of this is controlled by the DOM. And we've actually already been using this to a very small degree. So let's take a look at our code again. I'll open up the Explorer and we'll go to utils.js. And if we look at our show message function, we've used this throughout the whole course, and it actually uses the DOM. Document here represents the web page as a document, and that's a JavaScript object. And this object has a method. You can see the dot and the method name getElementById. So this method returns another DOM object, which has a property called text content, and that's the text that we see on the web page. So we can finally explain how this function works. We have an object and a method which returns another object which has a property called text content, and we set that to the parameter message. And our other function works exactly the same way. We use document as the web page that has a method which returns an object which has a property, text content. So document is the built-in object that refers to the web page. I'm back at MDN and I searched for a document object model, and there really is a lot of documentation on this. If we scroll down, we can see what are called DOM interfaces, which are what relate to objects that we can work with in JavaScript. But this is really beyond the scope of this course. So for this clip and the next few clips, I'm just going to point out a few key features that we commonly use when working with the DOM. And one is this object here, element. An element is basically a tag in the markup. Let's go to the code and see that. Looking at index.html, I'll search for get a grip. Here it is. And we can see this h1 tag right here. That's called an element. And we can access this element by its ID, message. Likewise, this h2 tag here, we could access that by its ID, %off. But what we want in JavaScript is the object that represents this element. And we saw how we can get that. I'll go back to utils.js. And the way to get an element is by calling this method on document. We call getElementById, passing it the ID, message. And once we have that element object, we can access the text content property to set the text. So this shows us how to access the web page with document. And one of the more common methods is this getElementById method. Another thing we could do is style this element. And we'll take a look at that in the next clip. Normally, we would style a web page using a CSS file or some preprocessor technology such as Less or Sass. But occasionally, we want control in JavaScript where we can style the elements ourselves with code. I'm here at MDN again, and I searched for HTML element. In our code, when we called getElementById, this is what we got in return, an object of type HTML element. And this is a very big object. If we take a look here, there are very many properties, and if we keep scrolling down, we'll get to a property called style. And that's the property that lets us overwrite CSS values. I'll click on it, and you can read here about working with this style property. And we'll just work with this simple style here. Let's say we have an element dot style property dot CSS property, and we're setting it to the value blue. So it's very simple to set a style. We just need to know the CSS property, in this case, color, but we could use any property. So let me grab the element. I'll create a constant. We'll call it header document.getElementById. And we know that the getAGrip string has an ID of message. And now that we have our header, I can access the style property. And let's set the color to red. I'll save it, and it turns red. Likewise, we can turn it any color. I'll make it blue. Or of course, we can set a hex value. Now it's white. And the only really tricky thing about this is that CSS properties sometimes have a dash in the name, and we can't do that. Let's say we wanted to work with the font weight. Normally, the CSS property would be font-weight, but that doesn't work in JavaScript because I don't have a dash in any kind of. So instead, we use camel case, say font as usual, or uppercase, and then weight, which starts with an uppercase letter. And you can see here that Visual Studio Code is helping us out. Font weight is what we want. And we'll just set this to thin. I'll put a value of 100. And you can see we have a thin weight, or I can just bump it up to 800. I'll save it, and it becomes bold. So we can easily override any CSS settings in JavaScript. You get the element, and you access the style property, and you access the CSS property in camel case. And if you're working with a unit such as a percent or pixels, make sure you specify that as well in the value. In the next clip, we'll take a look at how we can detect when a user interacts with the web page through a button. In JavaScript, there are often times when we want to know if a user interacts with a web page, and a simple interaction simply has to do with clicking a button. Let's see how we can detect this in JavaScript and execute some code when it happens. If we look at the website, I'll scroll down a bit until we see a button. Here's a button, See Review. And when I click on it, it seems to just refresh in place. So let's find this button in our markup. I'll go to index.html. I'll search for See Review. And we have See Review right here. I'll open up the editor. And we can see that this is an anchor tag, not a button, but we can still process click events on it. That's fine. It has a class of button for Bootstrap, and that's what makes it look like a button. The first thing we need to do is get rid of this href. That's what's making it update in place. When we click it, it just refreshes the page. So I'll remove that, and we'll handle the click in JavaScript instead of with the href attribute. So we need to give this anchor tag an ID, and we'll just call it See Review. And I'll save this, and let's go to our home.javascript file and get this element. We'll get it by calling getElementById, and we'll pass it See Review. So we'll just call it button, and we want to get element by ID See Review. Now, once we have this button or anchor tag or whatever element it is, we call a method called addEventListener. And we pass it two different arguments. The first one is the event that we want to listen for. Web pages have hundreds of events, but we're interested in click. We want to know when this button or link is clicked. And the second argument is a function. And this is similar to a function expression. It's actually called an anonymous function where we won't give it a name, but we will specify the opening and closing parentheses and the curly braces for the function body. And in this function body, I'll simply log out click. So again, what this code does is it watches button or a click event. And when that click happens, this function executes. It'll log out click to the console. So I'll save this and I'll open up the console. And here's our button. I'll click it and click appears in the console. If I click it multiple times, you can see the number to the left of the text increasing. So we're intercepting our button click, and we can execute any code we'd like. We can call functions, we can call methods on DOM objects, and modify this page however we'd like. So probably since this button is called See Review, one thing we could do is we could pop up a review underneath it as part of the web page. And we'll look at how we can do that in the next clip. Let's take a look at how we can use our button click to show and hide DOM elements. It'll act as a toggle button. This is a very common operation when you're working with JavaScript and HTML. So here's our button that says See Review. And what we'll do is we'll add a panel just below it that is the actual review that we want to see. So I added some simple markup for this. Let me search for See Review so we can find the button. And it's right here. Let me expand this. And I added this markup right here. It's a simple div with an ID of review, and that's how we'll access this. we'll call getElementById, passing it review. And for classes, it has a Bootstrap container and also a Bootstrap class dNone. That stands for display none. So it won't be visible at first, it'll be hidden. And it simply has a review title and some review text. And our main purpose is to toggle this div on and off by clicking the button. And the button is right here with the ID of CReview, the same button we worked with in the last clip. So the key thing to remember is that it has an ID of review right here. I'll go to home.js. Here's our code from the last clip where we're taking button and we're going to be listening for the click event and executing this function on a click event. The first thing we want to do is we want to grab that review div. I'll call it review, and we'll call document.getElementById, and review is the name. So just to start off, what we'll do is we know that that element is hidden, so let's show it. Review dot, and we want to access the classes for this element, and that's found in a property called ClassList. And on ClassList, we have other properties and methods. And what we want to do is we want to remove that dNone class. So I'll put dot remove, and the class we want to remove is d-none. So now when we click this button, it'll remove the dNone class, and we should be able to see that review. Let's take a look at it. I'll save the code, and I'll click the CReview button. And our review div does show up right here. So we successfully removed the dNone class. But let's turn this into a toggle switch. If we click it again, we want to remove it. In order to do that, we need a conditional. We need an if statement. If review.ClassList dot, and we can call contains. This is a method that lets us know if a certain class exists on the element. So if it contains dNone, that'll return true. Else, if it doesn't contain dNone, we'll execute this block. So I'll move this code to the right place now. And in our else block, I'll paste it, but we don't want to call remove. We want to call add. We want to add it back. So just to walk through this again, if our element contains the class dNone, we want to remove it. Else, we want to add it back. I'll save it, and let's see if the toggle works. We have CReview. I'll click it, and our review shows up. I'll click it again, and it hides. So the one last thing I want to do is just change the text of the button so that when we click it, it should now say close review so that the panel closes. And we can simply add some more code into these blocks here. So when we're showing the review, we still have access to button because it's in an outer scope. So I'll say button dot, and we want to access the text. So that would be the text content property equals, and let's say close review. And in the else clause, we want it to be the same thing, button.textContent, and we want to set that to CReview. I'll save it, and we'll check out our toggle switch. We see the review, and the text is updated in the button to close review. I'll hit it again, and it's back to CReview, and the review disappeared. So everything's working fine. The subject of DOM programming is a very big one, but this is definitely enough to get you started. You can use MDN to find out all about the DOM objects and events, like we've been handling the click event, but there are lots of other events that you can work with. And you can check out Pluralsight for other courses on the DOM as well. And that wraps up our discussion on objects. So next, we'll close out this module with the summary. We started this course module by looking at object properties and methods. We saw that there were two ways to access properties: object using the dot notation, object.propertyName, or we could use the square bracket notation. We specify the object without the dot and instead use square brackets, but the property name must be a string. Next, we took a look at passing objects to functions. We saw how functions can change an object's properties and methods. An object is passed by reference, so its members can change. And that's very different than passing a Boolean value or a number or a string, where if that value changes, it does not change in the calling function. Next, we looked at some standard built-in objects. We went to the Mozilla Developer Network and we took a look at date, math, string, number, and we saw the whole list of available built-in objects. And because of the large number of these objects and their properties and methods, You want to be sure to visit the Mozilla Developer Network to find out more information, or to use it as a lookup reference. Next, we looked at the document object model, the DOM. We saw how JavaScript has a built-in object, document, that we can use to find elements and modify web pages in a variety of ways. Next, we looked at styling DOM elements. Once we have an element, we access the style property, dot, and then the CSS property. And you just have to remember that the CSS property cannot contain dashes, as they do in CSS files. So we have to use camel case, as we see here. Anything after a dash would be capitalized, and the dash removed. And we simply set that property to its value. We saw how to detect button clicks. Once we have the element, we call add event listener, and we pass it the event we want to listen for. In this case, it was a click, but it could be any DOM event, and we pass it a function. The function gets called when the event occurs. Finally, we looked at how we can show and hide DOM elements, and we did this by using classes. Once we have the element, we can access a property called ClassList, which manages all of the classes on that element, and we can call the add method to add a class name. Likewise, we can call the remove method, specifying which class name we would like to remove from that element. And we also looked at the contains method. This returns a Boolean value whether or not the class name exists on the element. So that wraps up everything we're going to cover on objects. In the next course module, we're going to be working with arrays. An array can handle multiple objects or multiple values, so we'll see how to work with them and we'll see how to modify a web page based upon an array. I'll see you in the next module.